Politico's Burgess Everett joins the show to give fresh insight into the Senate gun deal. Plus, Mary Katharine Ham talks about media and guns. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can pick up a membership today if you want exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and exclusive stories that you can't get anywhere else. You'll also get this podcast a day early and the opportunity to appear on the show. In fact, we have a member segment this week that I am very excited about. We actually have a famous member, Mary Katharine Ham, will be joining us later in the show. But before we get to that, I want to focus on the Senate gun framework deal thing that they've got going on over there. And so we have another top Hill reporter with us this week. Burgess Everett from Politico is joining us to give us some insight. Burgess, can you just give us a little background about yourself for those who might not know you?
Sure. I'm the Congressional Bureau Chief for Politico. I've been covering the Senate for more than 9 years now, and I'm a kind of a Senate specialist. That's sort of my thing. I know most of the senators pretty well, and I've covered all of the people involved in these negotiations for many years now. So I actually know all four of them quite well.
Yep, and that's why we wanted to have you on. We like to have experts and people with specific insight into the current events, and there really isn't anyone better than you. We had, obviously we had John from Punch Bowl last week. So he's also fantastic, but
and the former bureau chief at Politico. So
that's right.
We have a long lineage of Hill reporters.
So I wanted to get, as much insider information, as much insight as possible. And you've been one of the top guys getting details on this deal. You're there much more often than I am. So that's why we wanted to have it on. Speaking of which, we're filming this on Thursday. Where do things stand right now?
Kind of like, it's being presented as a pivotal day, as yesterday was, which was Wednesday. But we're sort of at the point where folks are feeling some pressure to produce legislative text from this framework and have it ready to go by early next week. And in Congress, a lot of the times these big votes are wedged up against these recesses. The members really want to go home, and you don't want to let things, if they're controversial, hang out over the recess. And so we have a 2-week recess coming up for the July 4th holiday. And there's just an immense feeling that you got to get this thing passed through the Senate before leaving town and going back home.
Yeah, that's what I'm hearing from my sources on the Hill as well, that, they really have an aggressive timetable for this. They want votes to happen before that recess, and that means they got to get text together, real fast. Whether it's, I think this Friday, tomorrow would be pretty ambitious from everything I've heard, but maybe next Friday.
Yeah, and keep in mind when there's a 2-week recess and one of the weeks is well before July 4th, I think there's a little bit of wiggle room on the schedule once it gets on the floor. But you're not going to hear the leaders talking about that until it's really, that's a threat you bring out at the last minute to say, all right, seriously, for real, like, we're doing this, you're going to stay here until we're done. And we're not quite there yet because they're not done. And I'd say like the closest, if you're looking for like an analog, would be this infrastructure deal from last year, where you have a framework and then the challenge is turning it into text. And that took much longer than what the gun negotiators are trying to do right now. It's about like half the timetable. That the infrastructure deal took about 6 weeks to turn into text. So that was pretty painful. And so it's interesting how much more quickly this one's moving. And I think it's because of the sort of polarizing nature of guns compared to bridges, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think the calculation is that if it waits too long, there's going to be something that comes up to disrupt the whole thing, whether it's in the deal itself or outside of the deal. Last time they had talks like this, it was 2018, right? You had President Trump at the time expressing interest in passing some sort of gun bill even with red flag laws and so forth. And there were a lot of talks about that. It never got as far as this has gotten, but that was actually derailed by the first impeachment trial.
Correct. Yeah.
And so other things besides what's in this deal can actually derail these sorts of talks, right?
Yeah, and you have probably more insight on what's going on in the Supreme Court than I do, but there's a firearm decision pending there, which I could see changing the political environment on this issue. And then you
Mm.
also have the abortion decision, which is still not been released. So either of those things, the guns was more directly related. Abortion really has nothing to do with this bill, but Congress can get distracted so easily, and things could get more partisan on a daily basis. And so there's really, if you really want to get this done, there's no sense in letting it just sort of play out. And I think the other piece of urgency here to keep in mind is that there's still this reconciliation discussion happening on the Hill, which is this big party line bill Democrats want to do, and they're just straight up running out of time to do it. So the longer guns takes, if that were to go into July, it could erase that from ever happening. And so I think there's a sense that you got to get the guns deal done to see if there's anything else Democrats can do. They don't have many days left in the majority before November, if you look at the calendar.
That's actually one of the things that makes this whole deal particularly interesting, that Republicans are on board with doing it. But again, there's another factor too that just came up that probably not a lot of people on the Hill have even heard of yet. But apparently yesterday, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the gun industry's trade group, reported one of their top executives reported that the DOD is considering cutting off supply of a certain kind of 5.56 round that's commonly used in AR-15s. It's called a green tip, and it's estimated to be about 30% of the supply out there is green tip. And so the Obama administration had tried to do this through rulemaking a few years back, and it failed after a huge outcry against it. So if the Biden administration is moving forward with some other way of trying to cut off the supply of this ammunition to civilian markets, that could certainly cause enough of a sideshow blow up that it could undo this deal, I would think, in potential.
Yeah, and then the question might be for something like that, or even on the more progressive side of things like assault weapons ban or things like that. The question is, well, now once it's on the floor, are there going to be amendment votes on these things? And my sense right now, unrelated votes, but still within the gun category. And my sense right now is they don't want to have amendment votes on it. But let's say somebody didn't like that rulemaking. Well, you could have an amendment related to it if you wanted to, and maybe people don't want to take that. So even once they get text, then there's this like next level of, well, how does this actually go through the Senate? I mean, you can say no amendments, we're just going to move it through and block everything. That's the most efficient way to do it, but people may complain and say, I actually want the vote on this amendment. It could be someone within the group. So we're still multi steps away from this passing the Senate, and then it has to pass the House. So you're hearing a lot about how the framework's done, and that's the biggest part. I agree with that, honestly. When you have 20 people supporting it publicly, that's a huge breakthrough, right? But still kind of a lot of drama to get through, in my opinion.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of the details of this that you're hearing about this framework, because we got the press release and it gave a one sentence explanation for all these things they want to do. Right. We've had comments from senators, over time, but some of them are conflicting. And honestly, I want to get your understanding of what I think might end up being the actual most controversial thing. It hasn't been talked about as much as like the red flag provisions, but I think the 18 to 20-year-old background check process, it seems to be there from what the Trace reported and from reading the frameworks, one sentence, it sounds like they're creating a whole new background check process for 18 to 20-year-olds that includes what is effectively a mandatory waiting period, because it has this like 3-day period where the FBI gets to, do a more detailed examination of the juvenile criminal records. Is that in line with what you're hearing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I 100% agree with you that's, and I would even put it a different way. Like, I think it's the most consequential long-term piece of this as well, in addition to being controversial. But what's weird, right, is like nobody's really complaining about it. Instead, you're hearing a lot of complaints about how, from the Republican side, about how the red flag grants would work. Republicans, Cornyn, saying, I don't want states that refuse to implement red flag laws to not have access to the money that we're going to provide. And Democrats are trying to say, well, the whole point of this is to incentivize red flag laws. So why are we going to just give people money if they don't implement these? So that's one sticking point we're hearing a lot about. And then the other one is about how do you define a boyfriend or, in a domestic abuser case as it relates to getting barred from buying guns in the background check system. And then there's this issue, which is just not getting a ton of play. And I agree it's a big deal because it's sort of it doesn't raise the age to buy firearms for these folks, but it does sort of make a middle ground in terms of like, if you're in this age group, you have a new background check process that all of a sudden would magically, under my understanding, change as soon as you turn 21.
Yeah,
and
very
and
odd.
that's very odd, but current law is odd too, right? That
Sure.
The day you turn 18, what you did at 17 doesn't matter anymore. It's, sort of the way it's been talked about on the Hill. And so I don't know what the right thing to do is, but it's a big deal, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the most underreported part of this and the most underdiscussed, because what it does, like, effectively is change the background check system. Now, it only does it for 18 to 20-year-olds, but I think that's, if you're making a whole new background check process, I think it's going to be hard to convince gun rights advocates that isn't going to eventually get expanded to everybody. And so you're kind of slipping in this federal waiting period, is what it, I mean, from what it sounds to me like is, I don't know how much experience you have with the practical side of going through the NICS system to buy a gun. But right now, it's first of all, it's in the name that the intention is for this check to be instantaneous. It's the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, right?
Right.
Now you can have situations already where you get delayed, and that's the 3-day waiting period, and that's another part of this deal that we can discuss a little bit. But so in theory, it's not always instantaneous for everybody. If you have some sort of, maybe you have a really common name that a criminal also has, and so they have to make sure that you're not that person. You can get delayed for that reason. Maybe there's something, you have an arrest on your record that could include charges that would make you a prohibited person during that period where you're going through the legal system. There's things that already can delay you, but it sounds like what they're doing, and it's hard to know exactly without the text, obviously, but it sounds like they're going to just put everyone 18 to 20 into the delayed process automatically. Like it doesn't matter if they pass the check, they're getting into that delayed process until the FBI, I guess, reviews their juvenile criminal records, which is another huge.
And it might
part
have to do with what state you're in, right? Because there's 50 different state treatments for these juvenile records. And, if a state reacts to this law and makes these things pop up more quickly, maybe the background check and the delay period isn't as long. But the question that I've heard is about functionality. How's this going to work with 50 different states? I mean, you're really creating a new national standard for juvenile criminal and mental records.
That's what I don't get about it, though. Just real quick, is like, why aren't they just trying to add? I heard Tillis's comments a few days back, where it sounded more like they want to pick a couple of serious offenses, right? I don't know, rape and murder and
abusing animals as well.
Abusing animals, sure,
as well. Yep.
Right. So if you've been convicted of those things as a juvenile, they want to add those records to the background check system. That makes much more sense to me. Like, why not just ask the states to add those records instead of defaulting to putting every 18 to 20-year-old into a special new system for background checks?
Right. I mean, and then that's how does and this will require people far more intelligent than I to assess how the text actually looks. But I think me and you were going to be looking for, when there is text, sort of an explanation of the functionality, what this actually means on a year from now, once this thing's implemented. What does it actually mean if you're 18 years old and you want to buy a gun?
Yeah.
And I think part of the reason they're doing this, right, is the age of some of these mass shooters. And I think, we hear a lot of talk in Washington about actually addressing the problem. I want to do something that actually addresses the problem. And there does seem to be some bipartisan consensus that these folks think this would address the problem. There's like a hunch that the Uvalde shooter would not have been able to buy the gun that he bought. You know?
Yeah,
And I don't know that that's actually true, but
I don't think that's
what they're
true.
reacting to.
Right, and that's the other thing. Like, I get it because the shooters were Buffalo and Uvalde. They were 18. Although obviously, not all mass shooters are under the age of 21. So, right. I mean, not the obvious question for gun rights proponents is like, what happens when there's a mass shooting perpetrated by somebody who's over 21 years old? Are you just going to expand this system to everybody? That's would be the obvious concern.
Yeah.
But yeah, and the other thing too is like this started coming up, and it was never clear to me. I don't think there's any evidence that the Uvalde shooter was ever actually convicted for any of these things that he did. Right. That was the big problem. It's like, like he had warning signs like most of them do, but nobody followed up on them. And he wasn't, I don't believe he was convicted for his animal abuse or, sentenced to any sort of, I mean, I guess we don't know if his records are sealed maybe. Right. But, so maybe there's
some uncertainty there though about if this would have actually prevented this particular shooter.
It doesn't seem like it would have unless somebody has information that he had a juvenile criminal record. Right. Which I don't think that's clear at this point.
I just don't know, but I know that the motivation here is because of the age of that particular shooter. Right. It's how we ended up in this instead of 18 to 25 or something, it's 18 to 21. And the thing you're bringing up is the slippery slope argument that you're going to hear from conservatives, which is, okay, you do this. This is just a half measure that's on the way to raising the age for firearms or things like that. I think the flip side of that is what you're going to hear from Republicans after this passes, maybe not before, is that they're not going to do anything on this issue for a long time and see how this works.
Yeah, I know that they're viewing this as like a pressure relief valve sort of situation, right? Politically. Right.
I mean, they want to talk, look, this is not something they want to talk about to win the midterm elections. I mean, it's much more simple. It's Biden's unpopular, inflation is bad. That's the whole Republican campaign, and that's what a lot of people in the United States care about right now. And so the idea from the McConnell side of Republican leadership is, hey, I feel good about where he feels good about where they are politically, and doing this doesn't do anything to change that in his view.
I wonder. I mean, that's right. That's obviously the calculation. I wonder how true it is. Like if you piss off all the gun rights groups heading into a midterm, I don't, is that good for your turnout? I don't know.
It may not be.
I mean, I guess we'll see.
And then from the Democratic side, similar, right? Like their messaging to their supporters, gun control groups, but also liberal voters and things like that is that we're going to come back and get more after this. This is just the first step, and that's similarly interesting messaging because they may lose control of Congress in just a few months, and they're not going to get more than that. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I think to get the things that Democrats have been talking about for a long time, assault weapons ban, expanded or universal background checks, you probably need to get rid of the legislative filibuster.
I think you need more than that because even if you got rid of the filibuster today, I don't think they could pass an assault weapons ban. They haven't passed one through the House.
I agree. I mean, part of getting rid of the filibuster right now would be having more Democratic seats, right? Like, so you'd have to have a larger majority, and you'd have to have
you have to have a significantly lot, because
55-ish seats is probably what I would envision.
What did they get to? I think they barely got to 218 in their own party on magazine bans in that House package. They haven't tried to do an assault weapons ban since they took control in 2018. Because I mean, I think the brass tacks is they don't have the votes for it. That's pretty obvious, right? So it's not just like the NRA money that's stopping it, right?
It's structural. It's the structure of American politics, how the Senate is currently constituted, and how far a big Democratic majority in both chambers is with a Democratic president, right? Like those things could all be very far away. And it's interesting because at the time, the pre-impeachment talks about this, I had thought the incentive structures aligned a little bit more for Republicans because you could have Trump pushing them to sign on to something that was a little out of their comfort zone. He was going there, and then obviously it fell apart because he got very angry about impeachment. Right. But will there be another Republican president that dives into this issue? It seems doubtful to me, but
Trump's been out there attacking this, or at least his spokesperson has been out there attacking the deal so far. So,
Right.
I don't know.
And I think the place you'll see that manifest itself the most is if and when this comes to the House, where they really listen to what Trump's saying a lot more. I think you'll get,
the Democrats are going to have to pass this on very thin margins if they do it.
Right. And it continues a dynamic we've been seeing in the Senate where more Senate Republicans will vote for things than House Republicans, despite the fact there's 4 times as many House Republicans as there are Senate Republicans.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you'll get probably the 4 or 5 that voted for the House package would probably vote for this. I don't know how many more you get beyond that, honestly.
Yeah, and I would be interested in where if any of the Texas House members, Republicans, are even considering voting for this, because it's the big player, I think, here is John Cornyn, the senior senator from Texas, and, I'm interested to see how this affects his own internal politics, both at home and here in Washington.
Yeah, because one thing that's been interesting. First of all, John Cornyn was supposed to be on the show this week, but he wasn't able to make it, so he's going to be on next week. So we will be able to talk directly to him about all of this, which will be good. He did do Dana Loesch's show, so it's not as though he's avoiding these sorts of interviews,
right.
I'd say, but he just didn't have the time. It didn't work out, but next week we're supposed to do it. We'll see how it goes. But yeah.
You'd probably rather do it after the
text
deal is done, right?
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure. But he's got to, the interesting thing about him, right, is that he is the one that gives a lot of credibility to this deal because he's been the go-to guy on guns in the Senate for Republicans for, a long time. And I think that's probably why they were able to get to 10 off the bat is because he joined in on it.
Yeah.
But Cornyn is taking a lot of personal responsibility for this deal. A lot of this is hinging on what he says and does. And he has already made some comments that indicate the deal might be in trouble. I don't know. What's your feeling about that? He obviously came out and said that there's issues with, you alluded to this earlier, there's issues with the red flag funding and there's issues with the boyfriend, what exactly constitutes a boyfriend, right? We have domestic violence right now means violence against anyone that you're related to, that you cohabit with, in a romantic relationship, or you have a child with, or you're married to, right? Those are the 4 things. They want to expand it to people who you're in a romantic relationship with, but you don't live with.
How do you define that?
Yeah.
That's what's challenging now because Democrats would like that to be a broad definition.
Mm-hmm.
Cornyn said yesterday, I want that to be pretty narrow. I don't want this to just sweep up everybody that's ever been convicted of these things because it could be many years ago.
Right.
That's his reasoning here. And so, no, I don't think this thing's ever been so far in danger of completely falling apart this week. But I think, what you're seeing is maybe what's frustrated Democrats in the past on other issues is Cornyn's a pretty tough negotiator. He's not afraid to use the press as a negotiating tactic to say this thing's going to fall apart if you don't come to the table. You know what I mean? So he's playing. That's an outside game where he's making people say focus, let's get this done. I'm serious. And then I'm not in the room, so I don't know, but he's got a separate inside game where he has a legit relationship with Chris Murphy. They've worked on improving the instant background check system a few years ago.
Fix Nix.
He's got a legit relationship with Kyrsten Sinema. They've traveled to the border together and have written immigration legislation together. So I think that's the 2 sides that he's showing. And it's not lost on me when I see a story in Fox News saying, here's all the things John Cornyn has kept out of this bill, right? That's the way he's trying to message it publicly to conservatives, which is to say, I'm fighting for you. And we ended up with these smaller things. I kept these big things out. You and I know the assault weapons ban, universal background checks. These were not in the discussions, but this is the way he's sort of messaging it to kind of the right and gun owners who care a lot about this issue.
Yeah, I wonder if that works. It's obviously that's his message he's trying to put out, that they are stopping these other proposals by agreeing to these more limited ones. But the counter to that is that they could just not agree to this deal either. There's nothing forcing them to do it. So you look at it. One thing that's interesting for him, I think, is, in the early days after Uvalde, we wrote at the Reload a piece about what's on the table, what could happen, and you look at Florida after Parkland, and they passed a red flag bill. They raised the age to buy, AR-15s and other similar firearms to 21, and then, so in theory you could see something like that happen in Texas because they're politically similar states. Texas is kind of trending a little more blue, maybe not as much as a lot of people in media like to think it is, but and then Florida's trending more red over time. I think everyone acknowledges that. And so they're somewhere close to each other. They're very large states, but instead what we've seen is, Abbott has talked about upping enforcement with the laws that they passed recently. They had a lie and try bill that he came out and he sent a letter saying, we should do more to enforce our current laws instead of pushing for any sort of red flag or boyfriend loophole stuff that's in this federal deal that Cornyn is backing. So there's pretty different approaches, it seems like.
Yeah, and I mean, I know Rick Scott pretty well as a senator, and I covered his Senate race in 2018, and he was in this unique position, right, where he's the governor running for senator. So he signs the bill that you just talked about, and that's not something he wants to see on a federal level. So in some ways, the political incentives for him were different than they would be for Greg Abbott, in Texas. And by the same token, like, what are Cornyn's incentives? This is a guy who talks openly about wanting to be the Republican leader at some point. Does this help him or hurt him in that quest? I think it depends on how many votes he gets from Republicans. He told me yesterday he wants 70 plus. That would mean 20 Republicans vote for him. That seems like a high bar. If he could meet it, I think it helps him, right?
Yeah, if he can, but if
he gets 11, that may not help him.
Yeah,
but he was also just reelected. He was just reelected. And in my view, on a lot of issues, he's sort of the median Republican. So when he's involved in negotiations, it feels like there's a chance you get 60 votes when you have a narrowly divided Senate like we have now. So that's why he's been involved in immigration negotiations. That's why he's been involved in criminal justice reform negotiations. It's like sometimes Susan Collins or Lindsey Graham will be involved in negotiations, and they're important deal makers too, but do they bring along a large chunk of the conference? And sometimes the answer is no. With Cornyn, the answer has proven to be yes so far. And by large chunk, 10. 10 is significant. That's the most important number. Republicans in the Senate will care if it's a lot more than 10, and reporters like me will care a lot more, but probably Americans are just going to be paying attention to whether it passes or not.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's interesting to think about as far as the political implications for Cornyn himself, because obviously I don't think he's going to challenge McConnell, but McConnell's he's getting up there in age, so he's not going to be around forever. And there's the three Johns, right, that are supposed to be the ones who want that role down the line. And, on the one hand, you're right. Like, it's impressive coming out of the gate with this framework that he got 10 Republicans at all involved. Yeah. And I don't think that would happen without John Cornyn being, signed on to it. And especially since McConnell's not even one of those votes yet, right? But at the same time, he said he wants the majority of the caucus, and I don't see how they could get that, given what the details are that are coming out about this bill. Right. And to me, I think 13 to 15 is the high end, right?
Well, that's partially why he's talking about those two issues you were just talking about: red flags and domestic violence, and boyfriend loophole. And I think those things will probably determine in part, do Republicans feel like they got the better end of that deal? Well, hey, maybe they get 4 or 5 more votes because of it. Do they feel like Democrats rolled them right at the end? Well, maybe you're right. They get 13 votes, and it's still a big deal, but maybe a little bit of a disappointment in terms of how badly it splits the Republican conference.
Yeah. I guess it's one thing I do wonder too is about the Democratic side. Like, how much could they push before that falls apart on them? I think right now that, they can look at it from the Democratic side and think, well, yeah, we're not getting what we really want. Sure. But we're not really giving up anything, frankly.
Yeah. Right.
Because there's no pro-gun provision in this framework at all. Even Manchin Toomey had some pro-gun sweeteners that they threw in there. So it's that in that sense, it's fairly remarkable. But I do wonder, okay, if they change the red flag grant program to be just a grant program for any sort of crisis intervention law, how far can you push that until the liberals in the Senate start to say, what's the point of this deal?
Right. And, my understanding is that the Democrats saying we'll basically take anything in public is a little bit different than the way they're acting in these negotiations. Like one thing that they had legit been pushing for that was not in the framework was a mandatory waiting period, which, I don't know how realistic that ever was. But that was something that was actually discussed, behind closed doors. And so when that was out, I think Democrats felt like they were giving Republicans, something, because I think they had been drawing a little bit of a hard line on that in these private negotiations.
Yeah. It's interesting. And you've already had AOC come out and talk about she's the only one who's brought up complaints about the background check system for this process that they're creating for 18 to 20-year-olds.
Yeah.
But on the other side of it, the sort of criminalization of schools side, or the privacy aspect of opening up cases that were supposed to have been expunged or records that were supposed to be expunged. I also think that sort of there's a critique there that it's a weird half measure to only look at juvenile records for people who are 18 to 20. I mean, why? So once they turn 21, the fact that they had a disqualifying juvenile record doesn't matter anymore.
No longer matters. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think something else you'll probably hear from Democrats is we don't really like the school security stuff.
Yeah.
But we're going to vote for it anyway. And I don't know how true that is versus saying we didn't get everything. That's an important part of these compromises too, is highlighting what you didn't get to say, I'm with you guys that wanted more, but I have to take what's in front of me.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing about Republican side of this is what are they going to do? All they can really point to is what wasn't in the bill. On the on the more restrictive end to say, here's what we got. We didn't pass some more. That's what Cornyn's argument is. So
yeah, and I would not rule out something in that framework falling out. I wouldn't rule that out. I think that's a possibility.
What do you think would fall out?
The thing about the boyfriend loophole is that that's been discussed before as part of the Violence Against Women Act.
Right.
And they had to pull it because of the difficulty of reaching this definition of what a romantic partner, is. And so I'm not predicting that's going to fall out, but that's the thing that surprised people the most on Sunday when this thing came out, was the inclusion of this, because I felt like they thought, we tried, we couldn't do it. This is sort of off the table. And cinema has been very insistent that this is the place to do this. And that's sort of why, Cornyn and Tillis have been entertaining it.
It's very strange to me that because expanding domestic violence, yes, I understand that obviously that can get into thorny territory as to what the heck a romantic partner means under federal statute. Of course, that will be difficult. But, it also seems like a less controversial thing than creating an entirely new background check process that has a de facto waiting period in it. You know what I mean? So it's just odd to me that's that's where Cornyn is focusing his critiques and energy right now. But I guess one of the big problems is there's no text, so it's hard to know exactly. All we have are these reports and what senators have said. And so, but that's why it's important to bring on somebody like you who can give us much more insight into it. And so I'm really glad that you were able to join us. Can you tell people where they can find more of your reporting? Yep.
Politico.com. I try to have a good story up there almost every day. And you can follow me on Twitter at Burgess EV. My last name is Everett. So thanks for having me on, Stephen. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. We appreciate it. All right. We have another one of my favorite segments, the member segment. This week we have Mary Katharine Ham, who's a Reload member that many of you probably already know, but she's agreed to come on and give us a little bit of her backstory and how she came to be a Reload member and her relationship with guns. So Mary, welcome to the show. Can you just tell people a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Big fan of the Reload and all the work that you guys do. So much appreciated.
Thank you.
Well, I am a CNN commentator and author. I guess a free speech enthusiast. I've sometimes done the hard work of teaching about free speech on college campuses, even elite college campuses. So that's
only getting harder work.
Yeah, that's my
That work's only getting
passion.
harder.
But I do a lot of, if you can tell by those two job descriptions, a lot of talking to people who don't agree with me. Like that's my gig. That's what I do. And I enjoy it because I like to go across lines, and I like to make those connections, and I like to sometimes even, if it's The View or wherever, go into a room of people primed to dislike me and prove that they're not going to by the end. That's my favorite kind of challenge, because I think it's good for the country for people to be able to speak in those ways, and so I attempt to do it pretty regularly. I am from North Carolina. I was actually born in Alabama, grew up in North Carolina, went to the University of Georgia, so very, very Southern.
Very Southern, yes.
But part of my the reason I became who I am is because I grew up in a liberal college town in Durham, North Carolina. So everyone thought the same things in my town, and I was always interested in why and whether we should test those ideas. And that was just sort of naturally who I was as a person and what my family was about. My family was certainly a little bit right of center compared to, or maybe centrist compared to the rest of the city. But we were not a political family. I just felt the need to question the beliefs of the people around me, and because they conformed so often. And so that led me to different conclusions, which is why I'm sort of a libertarian leaning conservative today.
Yeah. Then, so did guns play a role in that as well?
So I would say, because I grew up in the South, they were always sort of in the picture. It wasn't an oddity. But when in my actual household, we didn't own guns. My father grew up in Georgia, and my mom in rural Virginia. So both of them had as kids, but in their houses growing up. But we didn't in my house. And I know my dad was former military and quite a marksman, and he took great pride in it. He had his patch from his Air Force days, and so we had heard about that. And I think the main place I was first exposed as a kid was my aunts and uncles in rural Virginia were hunters, and they would once in a while have all of us out to the hunting cabin, and everybody would bring back what they had killed, and we'd have a nice feast over there, and they would also do target shooting out on that farmland. And so my dad would show us what that was like. So that was like sort of my first exposure as a kid. And
you still do you still shoot today? Or have you gotten into hunting at all? Or
So I've never hunted actually, like but I like target shooting. I like skeet shooting. I don't do it very often, if I'm honest. And my husband is quite skilled in many things firearms, and I should take advantage of his expertise. But sometimes being coached by your husband is not like the ideal dynamic.
Yes. You should, what you should check out is like A Girl and a Gun. They've got women's shooting leagues that talk about that.
Because
kind of thing.
I've been thinking that I should do it more often, because I'm a naturally decent shot. But I always sort of surprise myself. The last event I did, I think, was it was some gathering of conservatives and leaders and whatnot. Former Speaker Ryan was out there, and they were all doing skeet shooting, and I actually performed quite well. And I was like, that's good, because you don't want to go out there in front of all these people and be terrible at it. But I should do it more often because I enjoy it, and I would get better at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one thing that's interesting, right, is the way that the media often portrays firearms, and you're somebody whose family owns firearms, whose husband is adept with guns. And I think that's probably fairly rare on a lot of these shows that you go on. Yeah. On CNN or The View, and a number of other outlets that you've discussed. What's it been like for you in these sort of atmospheres and major media outlets? They bring you on, but you're somebody who comes from a pretty different cultural background on a lot of things. Right. But guns is one of them. Right? Yeah, I
think I'm often in a position of, and I enjoyed, I think it was the Reload piece this week that was guns are normal and normal people use guns. It's like
David Yamani.
I love
that guy.
Not only is it normal, but the coalition of people who own guns is getting bigger and more diverse by the day, particularly over the last 2 years. And so I find myself often in places where there's a lot of ideological agreement outside of me, explaining that things are actually quite normal to plenty of Americans that they think are very exotic. And so, I mean, a great example is I was on The View and had to, like, at one point just reset because we were talking about the national anthem and the flag. And I was like, I just want to give us a baseline that, like, most Americans really like the anthem and the flag. Like, it's not controversial to them.
Right.
So that kind of thing. And I think guns are a similar subject where they don't know a lot of people who have used them, who are, you know, or maybe they do know people and those people don't talk about them because they're not gun fetishists like they assume all of them are, right? And so they just haven't been exposed to this as a normal part of life. And so I find a couple things. One, that most folks who speak about gun control in media and their desire for it, they sort of like blank out the fact that there is any gun control that currently exists. Like it is always a baseline of 0 to them. Like, well, we just need to have sensible regulations. The amendment says you can regulate. I'm like, we have lots of regulations, guys. We have many regulations. Differs by state, federal versus state. There's lots of them out there. So let's start from a real understanding of what the baseline is and what the regulations are before we start talking about what you want to add on top. And I think an illustration of this is that in the proposed sort of framework for some of the laws that they're talking about and that might get through the Senate. Mm-hmm. One of them, I believe, the crackdown on firearms, licensed firearms dealers, is basically already part of the law, and they're sort of restating it. You probably have a more nuanced understanding of this, but this is one of I do think people fall into this trap of being like, well, God, we got to take care of this, and it's like, well, that's actually something we've done.
Right. Yeah. There is a segment. It passed the House bill, and it's now part of the Senate framework that talks about, you know, straw purchases and gun trafficking. Right. And as far as I can tell, all it does is just add another statute that does the same thing that's already in current law. I mean, you already cannot buy a gun for another person outside of, you know, gifts to family members, outside of a bona fide gift to a family member. So, you know, I don't know why they're deciding to make it double illegal to do that, but it doesn't seem to add any additional penalties or change how the law is already currently enforced. I mean, in fact, DOJ just announced, the Attorney General just announced a big prosecution about somebody who made a bunch of, who was selling guns without a license when he should have had a license. That's another aspect of the bill. Yeah. But
it's the double secret.
That's the kind of stuff. Yeah.
It's the double secret probation of gun law.
Right. And yeah, you know what? That also reminds me too, your point there about AR-15s, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, there's one hanging on the wall behind me here, but like these are the most popular rifle in the country. Right. They're very popular. And often you'll get people in media talk about them as though they're these bizarre, you know, things that normal people would never need or want. And it's like, well, the problem is a lot of normal people do already own them.
Yes.
They're all and you're just sort of, like casting aside that whole population of 20 million. Yeah, there's 20 million of them. I don't know that there are 20 million people who own them. Right. You get the idea. There's a lot of people who own these. Yeah,
I think, there's this sort of projection of this exotic nature onto all guns and all gun owners. Yeah. And it's just not the case. And like I said, the numbers are going up and the diversity of gun owners going up, really in huge ways, even in just the recent past, if you take time to understand any of that. The other thing I run into a lot is arguments about, and I don't mean to discount every argument for gun control immediately, but they all do seem to rely on this idea that like, we just need less of these guns. And I'm like, okay, well, first let's start with the fact that there's a lot of them. There's more than there are Americans. Okay. So we have a lot. We also have the Second Amendment, which means you can't just ungun people. That's not a thing that you can do. And then you get down the road to like, well, we could just be like Australia. And it's like, okay, well, now you're talking about banning and confiscation, which is a whole other barrel of monkeys, so to speak. So I think a lot of people are not, because they don't understand the situation and the actual gun culture. They talk about this sort of parody of gun culture because they don't understand what's actually out there. They end up proposing things that cannot be done constitutionally, that would not work just logistically in this country, even if they would work constitutionally. And you end up, I think, having a pretty dishonest conversation, because sometimes if you lead people down the road, they'll just say, well, yeah, I just want to get rid of semi-automatic long guns. And this has actually happened on air before with somebody where I just asked. They said, yeah, just semi-automatic long guns. And I was like, well, that's interesting, because most crime is committed with handguns. So what would you do about handguns? Well, we should get rid of the semi-automatic handguns too.
Right.
Like, well, what you don't understand that's basically just all the guns. Like, you just said all the guns. But that same person will say in the same segment, look, I grew up in a place that had guns. I understand guns. I don't want to get rid of them. It's like, well, do you not? Because you kind of do.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. It's just like total lack of basic knowledge about guns, how they function, how the laws currently work, why people own them. You get all of these things. They're just constant straw man arguments that are based on ignorance. Like, they just don't understand or know anything about gun owners or guns. And so, yeah, they'll think they're putting forward some sort of moderate position, or they'll act like they are. And really, they're talking about banning and confiscating all of the guns.
Like, it's not actually moderate. One of the things I like too, there is a move, and it's less frequent than just not knowing about guns, but there is a move also where if you say like, hey, you should know more about this before you talk about banning it, they're like, no. I'm very proud that I don't know anything about guns. Okay. That is what makes me pure enough to have the discussion. And you are dirtied up by your knowledge of the thing we're trying to ban. So you stay out of this. And I think, look, there can be a tendency to get very pedantic about gun knowledge in some cases, right? And to exclude people from the conversation that way. But basic knowledge would be good. Like, semi-automatic versus automatic should be sort of like something you're shooting for, so to speak, before you go on air to speak about this. And sometimes there's just like pride in the ignorance, and that's not serving anybody.
And it's a huge problem. And I agree, right? You know, look, I understand what some people are getting at. Like, just because somebody misidentifies something technical about a firearm when they're talking about it doesn't mean that their views are totally forfeit and you don't need to think about them or have policy discussions or whatever. That's fair enough. But, you know, especially if you're a reporter, if you're a journalist and you're trying to inform your audience, you should have a base level understanding of what you're talking about. That's really what I've
It seems like a simple idea.
It really is a simple idea, right? I mean, and this, Stelter had me on a show and I was up against Mother Jones, editor-in-chief, and she was saying, like, and that's the point I was trying to make. And she was, recasting it as like, oh, if you don't understand that AR means armor-light rifle, then you can't talk about guns. It's like, no, that's not what I mean. If you don't understand what semi-automatic and fully automatic are, then you should at least learn that very basic piece of information. It's not complicated. I know that there are aspects of gun policy and guns that are complicated. And if you perhaps consult with experts before you write about those things too. But at the base level, you should have it's kind of like if you became a sports journalist, right? If you started reporting on basketball and you'd never even watched a game of basketball on TV or dribbled a basketball, it's going to be very difficult for you to properly explain the topic to your audience.
I grew up in a state where they play basketball. I knew people who played basketball. I've never actually seen the game.
I've never shot a basketball.
No, it is to some extent, and this is something that bothers me about journalism in general, is that there is this tendency in modern journalism to demand emotionalism almost above all else, right? So if you are soberly, like, sort of bringing the room back to like, okay, well, let's talk about what this proposed legislation would do, and let's talk about the nature of the guns that it would affect and the people that it would affect, that doesn't show proper respect for those who have been hurt by gun violence, because you're not emoting in that moment. But frankly, journalism's job should be to get beyond that pretty frequently and to not stay in that emotional moment, even though there's power in that and there's good reason for that, right? When we have terrible things happen, it is our job to be adults and adult thinkers. And this happened on COVID too. It's not just gun violence. It's our rational risk analysis and approaching things with a sober mind and trying to figure out the costs and benefits is what we should be doing. And too often that does not feel like what the job is. The job often is just to feel and then to talk about.
Yeah. And honestly, this is why I'm always very hesitant to go on national media in the wake of one of these horrible shootings, because I am always concerned that even if I'm there to talk about policy, that's what they're having me on to do. There's always a risk that you get cast as the token pro-gun person who's the avatar for everyone's anger at what had happened.
Yes.
And I'm sure you probably have experienced that being booked that way.
Well, and I'm heartened that I have been heartened that I've
hard.
seen you on national media, including CNN, and you have not been booked in that particular role, and they've let you do the thing that you're good at, which is to explain this in a calm way to people who don't always grasp all of it because they haven't been exposed to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was a risk to do. It was a risk to do those shows, but I luckily with CNN and the shows that I did, I had pre-existing relationships with like Jake Tapper and even Brian Stelter to some degree, to where I could at least have some trust that they weren't going to try and sandbag me in that way. Like, oh yeah, we're having you on as a reporter and analyst, but then really we're going to try and ask you why are these guns so bad?
Well, and Jake really does want to understand this stuff.
And so that's why I was comfortable doing it, but it's a risk. It is a risk. And you've I know you've been booked to play that role, not necessarily on CNN, but like you've had interviews in the past where that's how you get set up
on any number of issues. Yes.
Right. Not just guns, but all kinds of things. Yeah. And so it's difficult, but yeah, I mean, so why, I guess give us a lot of people say just don't even do these shows. Why even go on CNN?
I think I think it takes practice, and I think it can be challenging, but I think, and I think you're quite good. You are quite good at sort of bringing the temperature down and saying, okay, let's go back to the thing that we're talking about. Look, I think it matters to have people who are good at talking about these things in front of people who aren't used to hearing them. And sometimes that's like a hardship duty, and it's not the easiest thing in the world. But I also have been on plenty of shows where everyone agrees with me. And although that's fun, I enjoy the challenge of trying to make the argument to someone who's determined to disagree with my argument, right? And then in addition to that, I also at CNN, particularly on Jake's show, get a lot of honest back and forth. Like, just like, okay, I'm looking at you like I think you're a little crazy right now, but I'm not going to attack you for it, right? Like, that's kind of the vibe. And I can work with that. And I think it's worthwhile to have that out in the universe and to try to do that. And it trains me well for going and speaking to college campuses where like the ideological conformity is even more intense than other places. So I enjoy that opportunity. And I think it depends on the day, but it feels worth it to me to try to get that message out to people who don't usually hear it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. And I think it's important also for people who do agree with you to understand why you want to do these sorts of shows and the benefit of it.
It's okay if people think I'm crazy. Real. My coworkers think I'm crazy. The people who agree with me think I'm crazy. It's fine. It's like, that's where I'm comfortable.
There you go. All right. Well, we should probably have you back on to do a full podcast at some point when you have some more time. But I know you got to go. Where can people read more of your writing or hear you? You have a podcast,
yes,
right, with one of my former editors.
I will tell my social medias. MK Hammer on Substack and Twitter, and MK Hammer Time on Instagram, and then my friend Vic Mattis and I believe your former editor.
That's right.
We have a podcast called Getting Hammered because all of my social medias, all my products are branded with that. So Getting Hammered is on Apple and all the places you get podcasts, and it's sort of like a morning show feeling, a little newsy but not too heavy. So I think you'll enjoy.
Can I tell you a secret? That's going to also be broadcast on the show to everyone. I don't listen to many podcasts, but I listen to your guys' podcast.
Oh, thank you.
Like, I actually very much enjoy the podcast, and not only the episodes where I am explicitly mentioned, although I do, that is a good way to get me to listen to a podcast.
We try to shout people out, you know?
So keep that up. But yeah, it's great. You guys have great chemistry.
Thank you.
Honestly, and you both have such great personalities that I think it makes the show really good. In addition to being two smart people who have really good analysis.
Thank you. Well, we appreciate it.
Events.
We try to do the news without being a bummer. That's the watchword for that show.
Yeah, that makes sense. And last question before you go.
Mm-hmm.
What made you decide to become a Reload member? Because actually, I'm also a subscriber to your Substack too.
Thank you. Which I should do much more consistent work on, like you do on Reload. No, I joined because I like the work you do, and I think it's important to support people who do well-informed work and who are putting forth effort to do real journalism. Because look, I work in sort of the generalist opinion space, but I think reporting, even from a point of view, is hard work, and you gotta put forth resources to do it. And it's really valuable. And I like to add as much reporting to my columns as I can. And it can be really tough to fit that in and to make it sustainable. So I want to contribute to that and to make sure that the journalists around me are better informed. Because you are out there doing this work.
Wonderful. Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for coming on the show.
Sure.
And we'll have to have you on again soon.
Thank you very much.
Okay, it's that time in the episode where we speak with contributing writer Jake Fogelman. How you doing, Jake?
I'm doing well, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing all right. How's your week been going?
Can't complain too bad. It's really hot in Colorado this week. Been close to 100 every single day, so that's been fun.
It's not so bad in Virginia this week, actually. So I'm thankful for that, because usually here it's just muggy all the time.
I was gonna say, you guys have the humidity to deal with, so.
Yeah, it's rough, but it's been okay this week. Thankfully, we spent some time outside in Old Town Alexandria. It's been nice, but I'm sure we'll get just 100% humidity from here on out the rest of the summer. But at least we got one decent week. Anyway, so the news update this week, we've got the story out of Texas that you did, right? The Texas Governor Greg Abbott, he's reacting to the Uvalde shooting with some actual, policy that he wants to see implemented, or I guess he wants to see it more aggressively pursued by prosecutors in the state. Is that right? Can you tell us a little bit about it? You wrote a story?
Yeah, that's right. So Tuesday this week, he sent out a letter to the Texas District and County Attorneys Association, which, as the name suggests, just represents the various prosecutors across the state. And he essentially was just encouraging them to use their new lie and try law. They passed a bill last year in their legislative session that makes it a state felony for someone to lie on a background check form in order to obtain a gun illegally. So basically, he was just suggesting to them, hey, we have this lie and try law. I want you to aggressively pursue these, train your prosecutors to look out for these signs, and then actually actively prosecute them. And he was suggesting that was a way to try to crack down on shootings like what happened in Uvalde.
And so that's interesting for a couple of reasons, right? But one of them is so why would the state pass their own version of this law, right? It's already federal law, right?
Right.
That it's a federal felony to lie on the background check form. So why did they pass this law? Why does Abbott think it's important?
Yeah. So as you said, it is already a federal crime. And it happens several hundred times a year, if not thousands of times a year, where folks do lie on background checks. But where Texas decided to make it their own crime is the fact that the federal government pretty rarely prosecutes those violations. You see this is a common critique. If you're a gun rights advocate, you're probably familiar with this, is the fact that we don't really enforce these laws on the books. And it's sort of one of those instances where, the background check system maybe will flag someone that lied, but it really won't be followed up. Like ATF won't follow up with them, or it'll get referred to local federal prosecutors in whatever district the offense occurred in, and charges won't be filed, or, so it's very rare to actually see that get prosecuted. So Texas said, if it happens in our state, we'll follow up and treat it as a state issue instead of relying on federal prosecution. Yeah.
And I think that's fairly common that you'll have these state statutes that are similar in nature to federal statutes, just so that you can have two different jurisdictions go after the problem.
Right.
And so, when it comes to, at least when it comes to background check denials, you'll have like 100,000 of those a year, and then some of those, really only a small percentage actually get referred to DOJ for prosecution, and then even among those, only a small percentage actually get prosecuted, and then beyond that, even only really a very small number get convictions or plea deals out of the prosecution. So it is it's one of these issues that's commonly talked about in the gun world as something that is needs to be fixed. I guess you hear this a lot, and so Texas took that step to make it a state law, a state crime, and now I guess Abbott is. I mean, he's really just saying like, please use this law. I guess the other interesting aspect of this is, well, one, like, this wouldn't have had anything to do with Uvalde. It wouldn't have stopped the shooter in Uvalde. So just to be clear on that, because he wasn't a prohibited person. He didn't lie on a background check to get his guns, as far as we know. And so it wouldn't have had any impact on his particular situation. I guess this is one of those things where it's a solution for other potential shootings or to prevent shootings going forward. But the other interesting aspect of it is this seems to be more of the response to Uvalde inside of Texas. You're not seeing the governor push for new gun restrictions or even something like a red flag law. Instead, he's pointing to stricter enforcement of current laws, right?
Right. No, that's exactly right. I thought you made an interesting point on Twitter the other day when you contrasted this experience to Florida's after Parkland. Because you see, they're similar, not the same, but similar political dynamics, both trifecta red states. Florida's getting even more red. And the fact that, after Parkland happened, they were willing to go ahead and pass a couple gun control bills. They raised the age of purchase for rifles, for semi-automatic rifles to 21. They passed a red flag law. So we wondered, maybe would Texas potentially dip their toe in the water and consider something like that? And I think this kind of makes it clear that they're going to go down the route of, hey, we already have laws on the books. Make sure you just enforce them better. And that's the way we're going to try to tackle this issue. So I think that's an interesting thing to see, especially because it's an election year and it's one of the biggest red states in the country, to see how they're going to handle these types of shootings.
Yeah, I talked a little bit about that with Burgess on the main interview, but I think that's the biggest takeaway from this story is like this is what the response is from Texas Republicans, and it's interesting to see John Cornyn, one of the senators from Texas who's Republican, pushing a different a different strategy at the federal level, which is to do this framework, this gun deal that does include some restrictions, or at least on expanding what domestic violence entails to fit boyfriends, abuse by boyfriends into that definition, and then this new background check process that they're looking at. So it's interesting to see the divergence there from the state officials and the federal officials out of Texas, even the ones in the same party. And so I think that's why this story is particularly useful to understand.
Right. So and it's also interesting because it is an election year. Obviously, he's up for his governor's seat this November, and his challenger is one of the leading proponents of new gun control. To see how this might affect the political dynamic. Obviously, Beto O'Rourke's been outspoken. He crashed that press conference Abbott was giving in the aftermath of Uvalde. He's since doubled down again about confiscating AR-15s. And there's been some polling to come out to show that there's a plurality in Texas that actually want new gun control laws as a response of Uvalde, but it doesn't seem to be hindering Abbott's lead in the polls. And in fact, Abbott's lead appears to be widening, because there's a new poll out this week that shows him with a 19-point lead over O'Rourke, which is actually an increase in his lead. So I think that's a fascinating thing to point out, that the political dynamics don't necessarily work out the way you might expect.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's it's fascinating to watch the diverging strategies there and see their political impact, which we're going to see much more immediately in the Texas gubernatorial election than we will in, how these Republicans who vote for this framework fare, because Cornyn's not up for election for a while. And of the 10 Republicans signed on, 4 of them are retiring.
Right.
and another couple aren't. The rest aren't up for election anytime soon. So, that's interesting political dynamics there. It seems like, I don't know, Republicans at the federal level maybe view this as, as I said earlier, during the other interview, a pressure relief valve. But it's like, how are the politics actually playing out? I think you'll see it more clearly in the Texas gubernatorial election, because that's coming up now, and Abbott is taking a different tact than the Senate Republicans are on how to respond to the shooting, and he's going with enforce our current laws more strictly, and they're going with make some gun reforms, some changes to federal gun law to make it a little more restrictive. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I mean, so far, like you said, it seems Abbott's strategy is not hurting him politically. Because you got that very clear contrast. I mean, Beto's on the very far left of this issue, and Abbott's in the traditional Republican right side of the issue, where he's saying, don't pass new gun laws, instead enforce the current gun laws that we have. So how that plays at the polls in Texas should tell us something significant, because, Texas is still very much a red state, but it is trending bluer.
Right.
I don't think so. It could give us a decent barometer of where these strategies are headed.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see as the election draws nearer, if that changes at all. But it is, yeah.
But that's all we got for this week. We finally had a members interview. We had another Top Hill reporter on, so pretty good streak. This is a good episode, I think. Hopefully we can bring another good one next week. Hopefully John Cornyn is able to make it on that episode. I think I look forward to talking to somebody who's actually doing the negotiations and get his point of view directly. So hopefully that'll come together. If not, we'll find another interesting guest to have on in his place. But thank you guys for listening. If you want to join the Reload today, just head on over to thereload.com and buy a membership. We've got monthly and yearly memberships. The yearly one is, you're effectively getting 2 months for free. So that's not a bad deal, right? You'll get access to hundreds of exclusive stories that you can't find anywhere else. Lots of analysis pieces to give you more insight into what's really going on with guns in DC, in that Capitol building. And you'll also get this podcast a day early, and you can be the next, perhaps, member segment. So that's it for this week, and we will see you guys next week.